All right, so we left off with the war clouds gathering. The U.S., just like England, just like most other countries, were internally focused because that Great Depression was not a U.S. only phenomenon. It was a worldwide phenomenon, really precipitated, in part at least, by the calamitous effects of World War I, how costly that was, and how much it hurt the global economy. And there's some ideas in there that exacerbate it, one of those being the Dawes Plan, which we'll take a look at, which was, again, kind of economic foolishness, but you know, it's easy to say that in hindsight. So this will be the first part of, and then we're back together next Monday to kind of set the stage. This is getting the U.S. to World War II, because we stay out of it just like World War I for the first couple years. It starts September 1939, Hitler invades Poland. The U.S. doesn't join, obviously, until December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor is attacked. So just a quick review from the previous video, previous slides. The New Deal was FDR's plan, his umbrella ideas underneath it of how to attack social, economic issues, but what else? The mental issues, the kind of sociological phenomenon of depression, to give people the idea of hope. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he uses the new radio medium to address that, to talk to people with his fireside chats and explain things to them. The first 100 days, why important? Because that's kind of your honeymoon period. Right? New guy elected, let's give him some latitude, some leeway. Still sort of exists today. Maybe not as much as in the past, but still there. Specific New Deal programs, that alphabet soup of. The easiest ones to remember, I think, are the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, doing work in the National Park System, and the TVA, because it's so immediate to us here in the Tennessee Valley. The TVA obviously is still around, still kicking. Okay, his idea of court packing, the idea that the courts are deeming, like the National Recovery Act and Administration, this is unconstitutional, and he's kind of getting stonewalled and fed up with that from the Supreme Court. So the idea of, let's put some more on there. Again, it's not in the Constitution. Why don't we have 15 Supreme Court justices? And if I pick, we have 9, and I add 6 that all kind of support my agenda, I have a much better chance of those things being deemed constitutional in a Supreme Court review. Now, he doesn't go through with it because there's some backlash. And again, the Biden administration, same thing. They talked about it, haven't done it, probably for the same reason. The last one, what do we remember about the Treaty of Versailles? Nothing. Remember, that was the treaty at the end of World War I. It was 7 months before the Entente countries, the Allies, summoned Germany to Paris, to Versailles, the outskirts of, and dictated the terms of their surrender. So they surrendered, and now they take that much time to kind of cook up, what are we going to do? And the biggest thing, the word is punish. We are going to punish Germany for all this death and destruction. So one thing to remember from the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson's idea of the League of Nations is put in the treaty. Unfortunately, the United States does not sign on to the League of Nations. And Wilson kind of wrecked his health trying to promote that here in the States. But then we looked at all of the punishment, all the stipulations levied on Germany, that you caused this war, therefore you're responsible for reparations. You got to pay back all this death and destruction. We're going to cut your army down to really nothing more than a self-defense force. No air force, none of those submarines that we hated so much, and you can have a 100,000 man army for self-defense, kind of a police force almost. Your imperial holdings, those pieces of land in and around Europe and overseas, are going to be taken away. You cannot not reunite with Austria, because when you guys get together, bad things happen. So there's a lot of that. And those reparations, the Germans have no way of paying him back, so they crank up the printing press, and we looked at the idea of hyperinflation, how that line went straight up, where my loaf of bread cost 100 marks, a couple months later it cost 100 billion marks. So the money was worthless to the point of kids playing with it and people burning it in their stoves to cook and heat with. those are the outcomes of. So in the Treaty of Versailles, that levying of punishment sets extraordinarily fertile ground for a nationalistic leader like Adolf Hitler to come to power. Hey, Germany, things aren't so bad. Look, don't take this the wrong way, but Hitler and FDR both figured out the use of the new medium of radio very quickly, and they were both effective, albeit in different approaches to the whole thing. I hope that kind of makes sense. Yes, that's what I just said. Come to power in 1933. But there's a difference. In the U.S., the mentality is we kind of caused this by excessive credit, too much margin, too much stock market buying, but we can get through it ourselves. Whereas not all of Germany, I wouldn't say, but certainly Hitler and his inner circle look elsewhere for blame. And look, the U.S. isn't immune from that. The depression of the collapse of the railroads in the late 1800s. Who do we blame? The Chinese. Heck, they were the ones building the railroads. It must be their fault. Ain't wrong, but we got to put the blame somewhere else. And so Germany, one of the ways of rationalizing is when we looked at the line of trenches on the Western Front, a lot of where the war ended in 1918 was not in Germany. So the argument is, well, heck, if the trenches are in France and in Belgium, how did we lose? Right? Germany wasn't invaded. They weren't overcome. They just were fought out. And so Germans, and Hitler really grabs onto this, blames our politicians sold us out, our generals did a horrible job, and a lot of our businesses owned by Jewish folk are to blame because they didn't support the war effort strongly enough. Had they, this would have never come to pass. And so you're going to see the persecution of all three of those groups. And of course, the most infamous of that is the persecution of the Jews at the Holocaust. If we go back to World War I, there was that Zimmerman telegram and the idea that Germany, hey, Mexico, start a war with the U.S., and if you do, we'll get you back that land that was lost in the Mexican-American War. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt was very active in Central America and the Caribbean, that ugly Uncle Sam grabbing up islands, grabbing up pieces of property if we deemed it was necessary. FDR has a different approach, and because the idea is a good neighbor, we have no issues or anything to think about. There's no Zimmerman telegram coming during World War II. So our southern border is secure at that point. So that's why it helps pay off. Now we talked about, or I talked about this idea of the Glass-Steagall Act, the separation of the two banking pieces. So that was part of the New Deal. But with that comes a couple other economic thoughts. One is this, and I mentioned it briefly, the FDIC. It insures deposited money. It was $100,000 until the mortgage meltdown, and now it's been up to $250,000. If you have that much money in the bank and your bank goes out of business, you don't have to run to the bank and get the money out, right? It's insured by the federal government, and the banking industry pays a little bit of money into this to keep that fund up. And it was used a lot in the mortgage meltdown. And the great state of Georgia had the kind of ignominious first place, most failed banks in the country. Right? I don't know why, I haven't looked into it, but it's interesting. So that's out there. If you happen to have money in a credit union, they have something, it's different letters, but it's the same idea. Your money's insured in those banks, so you don't lose it. And then this, a group that's supposed to keep an eye on responsible stock market procedures, let's put it that way. Oversight and regulation of the stock market so that we don't see this blow up and then bubble bursting collapse happen again. Unfortunately, they're underfunded, undermanned, and come to find out, and this is kind of creepy, I guess, but you can look at you can look it up. After the mortgage meltdown, there was a look at, hey, SEC, how come, why did this happen? Where were you guys? You're supposed to be the good cop on the street making sure this doesn't happen. Well, come to find out, a lot of them weren't doing their job. Let's put it that way. And they confiscated a bunch of computers and found stuff that had no business being on government computers, so they weren't watching the stock market. Apparently they were watching dirty movies. And I'll just leave it at that. So here's the cover of 1938 Time Magazine Man of the Year. Still exists, right? And often it's woman of or group of, or I think the computer once upon not too long ago was the man of the year, if you will. And so you look at that and you go, well, geez, how in the world did Time Magazine get this so wrong? Well, think about it. 1938, Germany had been through, the Treaty of Versailles, the economic collapse that follows. And all of a sudden now we see this nationalistic leader kind of bringing Germany back. Pride in the country, right? Nationalism. That's where Nazi comes from, National Socialism. That Germany's kind of, the ball's rolling again. And so from the outside, not knowing what's going to happen in the future and not knowing his mind, he does look like a successful leader for the German people. And of course that armband now, I mean, that symbol, it gives you chills. But at the time, it didn't connect to all the evil that was to follow. So an interesting dynamic. Some more pictures, right? I ask in class what that symbol means. Give me a word that comes to mind. And evil, hatred, anger, things like that. And of course, it's been co-opted now in the realm of white supremacy, that we still see that. Believe it or not, a little bit of a tangent, the swastika, as it's known, you see that all over Oriental in Japan, the big torii gates as you go into Tokyo. That symbol's all over them because it was a symbol in the Far East of the virtue of man. And what the Nazis did was they took it and they flipped it over. So if you see those Oriental temples and you look at that and you go, geez, they got Nazi symbol. Well, no. The Nazis took it and turned it around the other direction. That's where it came from. Okay. Right? Hitler and the Nazi Party's big on symbology and propaganda. And so there's a couple more pieces of it, kind of the symbols of one people, one Reich, one leader. One Reich, kind of one realm, if you will, one nation, and Führer, leader. Right? It was supposed to be the 1,000-year Reich. It was supposed to last for 1,000 years. Of course, it lasts for not that many. And then on the other side, you have the militarized flag of the rising sun of Japan. Japan's kind of an interesting dynamic, is you've got two competing factions. You've got the emperor, who still in Japanese culture is kind of that divine right of kings, in lineage, in line with God, put in that position by God. But there's a military leader called Tojo, who really kind of co-opts and pushes Japan into imperial expansion and eventually into war with China through the South Pacific, and then eventually into war with the United States. That's the symbol of the emperor. If you ever get a chance to watch The Last Samurai, which is quite a good movie, you see that symbol all over the place. And then the call sign, if you will, imperial reign, that idea that the emperor is God on earth. Okay? So these will be the two prime drivers of the in World War I, we called them the Central Powers, kind of the bad guys, if you will. In World War II, these are going to be the primary powers of the Axis. Right? And so we changed names, and it's, I think, easier to remember. The Axis right here, the Allies, the good guys as far as we're concerned, certainly. Hey, so words of the day. December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. That's Roosevelt addressing the Congress the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so he actually modifies the words and changes it to this one. Criminal or evil act. The dastardly attack by the Japanese. Well, of course it was a sneak attack. They weren't going to tell them we're coming. But the U.S., the intel on the U.S. side kind of dropped the ball too. There was plenty of indications had we looked at it. And even the very rudimentary radar system on the island in Hawaii picked up the incoming wave of Japanese planes, but they mistook that for a U.S. fleet of B-17 bombers that were flying in from Los Angeles that day. Well, they got that one wrong. All right, and just some kind of words so you understand what we're talking about. National Socialist, that's where Nazi comes from. It's the kind of condensation of that word. And then you have different groups associated with the Nazi Party. Hitler, primarily uses fear, intimidation to keep people in line, and these were his elements. Maybe the SS, the most widely known, the Schutzstaffel, right, the protective echelon, the folks that are going to keep everyone in line. And then the Gestapo, the secret state police, Geheimstaatspolizei. So you combine those two words, you get Gestapo. So that's kind of where the words come from. And some others. The military thinkers post-World War I, guys like Erwin Rommel, Heinz Guderian, sit down and go, you know what, World War I was a disaster. And so they come up with this idea of blitzkrieg, lightning war. We're going to move. We're not going to bog down into trench warfare. And so the tank and the airplane figure highly in this concept of lightning war. And it's extraordinarily successful right off the bat. Steaming into Poland. By the way, when Poland's attacked, the Soviets come in from the other side, and then steamrolling through France all the way to Paris this time. They don't get stopped, right? And we still use it today. We call it maneuver warfare. Don't get bogged down. A Panzer is just the name of the German tank. The Wehrmacht was the German military in general. And there it is, Reich equals realm, the third realm of Germany. 1,000-year Reich, not so much. You kind of get a trend here on these quotes, and they're all from the same person, and you can probably figure it out as we go, but you can see how little empathy there is, in fact none, in the idea that just keep saying it over and over again, it becomes the truth. And man, I see that today with social media. Truth is irrelevant, repetition is now truth. If you look at, and in fact I have it, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, Hitler's book that he wrote while he was in prison, the biggest part of that book is on propaganda. And it worked for a while. Okay? So the world goes to war. There's a lot of pieces happening as we go into the 1930s, kind of the preludes to. So remember, Hitler was supposed to be forbidden via the Treaty of Versailles from rearming Germany, but he's doing it. And it's like, well, why doesn't the world react? That was supposed to be forbidden. Well, because one, we've got our own problems with depressions in not just the U.S. but around the world, and two, the idea that he's doing it at least partially covertly, because we don't have the overall kind of satellite spy plane network that we have now. So it's a little easier to hide. And now Italy has this idea of, we want to be an imperial power as well. So they start invading into North Africa. And so Hitler and Mussolini kind of combine forces. But Hitler also does a trial run of blitzkrieg in supporting a rebellion in Spain under the dictator Franco. On the other side of the world, we see Japan trying to do the same thing, become a big player on the world stage. And if you think about it, Japan's kind of a rock in the middle of the ocean, so they don't have a lot of natural resources, the things you need, the oil, the steel, like the U.S. is blessed with. And so now they're going to go through China and into the South Pacific to gather that kind of resource necessary to build and sustain an empire. Okay, there we go. Kind of one of the first things to violate the Treaty of Versailles, that word Anschluss, the idea that Austria, Germany, thou shalt never get together again. Well, Hitler, he becomes bolder and bolder as things go by, and the world fails to react. And eventually that leads him to invade Poland. The Sudetenland, there's a map, I'll show you where it is, but it's kind of this border area where a lot of the locals speak German, and so Hitler uses the argument, well, that's really German people, and we need, what did he call it? Lebensraum, living space. So we're going to take that area. Sounds a little bit like the Donbass in Ukraine now, right? And every time he seems to put forth this demand of, here's what I want, the French and especially the British are like, just give it to him. He'll be satisfied with that. And what it really does is embolden him to do more and more, up until the point that he just takes the whole country of Czechoslovakia. And he stands back and he waits for the war to start, and it doesn't. Like, wow, okay, I guess we're rolling into Poland next. That's what happens. So there's Franco, there's Hitler, obviously, and some of the elements of blitzkrieg, this idea of fast moving maneuver warfare, like these dive bombers, bomber aircraft, so much more developed than we saw kind of the kites, paper, and string approach of World War I airplanes. Here's a map. I know it's a little bit busy, but you can see, so we have Germany, we had Japan, and now we can add Italy to the Axis powers. And they're going to be part of the Axis for a while, right? But they're going to eventually fall apart before Germany. And so this idea of the Sudetenland is kind of this border area, Czechoslovakia, right? The violation of the Anschluss, reuniting with Austria, and then eventually taking all of Czechoslovakia, and then starting the war by rolling into Poland, September 1st, 1939. And Blitzkrieg overwhelms the Polish military. So this is a picture of Neville Chamberlain. He was the predecessor of Winston Churchill, and his idea was to appease Hitler. And he kept doing it, and that's why you see those sequence of events. So he comes home from the Munich conference talking to Hitler, and that's what he says: I believe it's peace in our time. Everything's okay, go home, sleep well in your beds. Right? Not so much. And so the invasion of Poland blows apart that idea that we can appease Hitler. There's no appeasing him. He was just taking whatever he could up until the point that he was going to take it militarily. Meanwhile, in Japan, you have this, we talked about them invading China, the Sino-Japanese War. They don't take all of China, but a lot of kind of the coastal, more toward the Japanese side of China. And that's an iconic and very sad picture of the results of a bombing campaign, the little baby at the train station just crying. And the Japanese were brutal, right? And we'll explain more. We're going to hear from the Bataan Death March folks the 25th, next Monday. And so they're going to talk about part of the mentality of the Japanese military. But they even used biological warfare. They dropped, I want to say, rats infested with bubonic plague on places like Nanking in China. So we see the development of these, just like World War I, these treaties. And so this is what puts together what becomes known as the Axis. Right? You can see China controls the coast, about a third of the territory, but not all of China. So at some point they're like, okay, that's enough, and we're going to move our focus down into the Pacific and toward the Hawaiian Islands. Okay, so they can still get resources, but they don't want to go too deeply into China and get cut off, right? And we don't want to go north because the Soviets, they've signed a non-aggression pact. They're not going to fight with Japan, so the Japanese don't have to worry about the Soviet Union. And guess what? Hitler does the same thing. He signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. So when he attacks France, he doesn't have to worry about his Eastern Front like Germany did in World War I. Otherwise, he could have had a two-front war right off the bat again. So here's a map of the Pacific, and you can see Japan, the Philippines. Some of these, though, are U.S. imperial holdings, and they're going to come into play as we start to fight the Pacific War. But the Japanese move through China, down through the Philippines, through Papua New Guinea, and down toward Australia. I talked about this non-unified policy, but kind of the Tojo gains the upper hand as far as directing the country toward war. And look, the U.S., unhappy with what's going on over there, starts to cut off oil and metal supplies, and those are necessary, right? Oil and steel to any development. And you can see how much Japan needs. So the friction between the U.S. and Japan starts to increase, and they need to look elsewhere to fill this need. Then we don't see Mussolini as a threat. We see Hitler as a threat in a sense, but the war hasn't started yet. And so you saw he was Time Man of the Year. So there's still that, well, he's brought Germany back, but not as focused over there. We're more focused really on Japan and their expansion at this point. Yeah, racism, criminal. Look, the U.S., most of the world knew about the Holocaust well before the end of the war. But how do you stop it? You have to defeat Hitler and the German military to stop it. Okay, so there we go. The beginning of World War II, France and Britain declare war. So 39, the fall of 39, Germany's focused toward their east, toward Poland. And then over the winter of 1940, nothing goes on. They actually call it the Sitzkrieg, nothing happening. But then by early 1940, they kind of repeat really almost the Schlieffen Plan in some respects, sweeping through Belgium and into France. But this time they're able to get all the way to Paris and get a big chunk of France under Nazi control. Not all of France falls, but most of it. And then the focus becomes, we're going to bomb England into submission and lead up to an invasion of the UK. And now Churchill's at the helm. And so with that sweeping excuse me, quick move through Belgium and France, all of a sudden the bulk of the British military is stuck on the coast at a place called Dunkirk. And so one of Hitler's first and primary tasks is to save his 350, 400,000 troops from capture, because that would have been the bulk of the British army. And that would have been, had that happened, the war certainly would have gone differently, because England's able to hold up to that Battle of Britain and Hitler's attempt to invade. Honestly, if you read about it, the Battle of Britain should have been a German victory, but they bomb England mercilessly. But what the English have is a couple secret weapons, if you will, which help them allocate their resources to the best ability they can. And so the Germans decide to stop bombing. They're not going to do, I think it was Operation Sea Lion. They're going to not invade England. And Hitler turns his focus to Russia, to the USSR, where he has a non-aggression pact, but he's going to invade anyway. So England holds on. So that's kind of the end of war on the western side of, but you can see how quickly the map of Europe starts turning black under Blitzkrieg. And so the Soviets also come in on the backside. So the Germans go into Poland but don't take the whole country. The USSR takes these Baltic states, and then unoccupied or free France, pieces of France are still not taken over. A couple other pieces, here's Dunkirk and that need to evacuate the troops off the coast. And the French, after World War I, put a lot of time and effort into this Maginot Line, of defensive line to preclude invasion by Germany again. So what do? Well, they go around it, of course. And some of these videos actually show you the radar and planning systems of the British, how they allocated their resources during this time, which was critical. So some pictures to kind of speed things up here. This is a cross-section of the Maginot Line. It's not just a wall. If you look at it, there's tons of pieces to this. This is like an underground living area. Power plants, recreation, hospital, an airlock. Right? Some evidence of still World War I thinking. Barbed wire entanglements and an airlock in case there's chemical warfare, which there really wasn't in World War II. So that's a pretty robust line. So the Germans just go around it. Can they do that? Sacre bleu. For the Battle of Britain, the thing the Brits had going for them was this beginnings of radar. And so they could tell when, where, and a little bit of the size of the incoming Luftwaffe bombing fleet. And so they could direct from these airfields all throughout England their fighters, the Spitfires and Hurricanes, to go intercept the incoming Germans. And what they could also do is, let's say the folks up here in Sheffield had been engaged heavily the day before, and there's another Luftwaffe fleet coming in from Norway. Well, these guys need some R&R, and the planes need fixing, etc. So we can launch folks from Coventry or from Norwich. So it doesn't have to be the closest. It's maybe who's the most battle effective, combat effective. And so that's that allocation of resources. So this, the picking up on radar gives me a vector, and then I can look at who's going to be most effective to meet that incoming threat. And so that's how they use their resources really well. And these are pictures of one. This is kind of the rudimentary radar systems, which were big targets for the bombers, of course, but they were quickly rebuilt. And then this is your command and control. And so these women working for the Royal Air Force are actually moving around pieces on the board, and so that the commanders kind of watching from above can see the big picture. So they translate the radar into something visible, and then they go, okay, we need to launch Spitfire Element 7 from Newcastle to go meet the incoming fleet. So pretty ingenious. As the war progresses in Europe, Americans become a little more focused on, yes, we're probably going to need to support this, but the environment we live in right now is the United States has declared itself permanently neutral. We're not going to go to war ever again. And so FDR, trying to support Churchill and the British, he has to do some kind of end runs around the Constitution. And so they come up with this idea, we're going to lend you stuff. You're not going to buy it. We're not actually, selling you military goods. You can just borrow it. And in return, you're going to lease us some military property in the UK, which still exists. I mean, I was stationed at RAF Mildenhall, the Royal Air Force Base there. Cash and carry, okay, some, not a lot. But FDR keeps pushing this idea of we're supposed to be the arsenal of democracy. And so you can see FDR now moving up. Destroyers. We sell them some P-40 fighter aircraft. But the problem is, because of the Neutrality Act, we can't deliver it to them. And so there's a scene in the movie Darkest Hour where Churchill's on this new transatlantic phone line that's out there, and he's begging him for those airplanes. And Roosevelt's like, you got me there, Winston. There's nothing I can do. And no kidding, he says, maybe if you bring some horses, nothing mechanical, but horses, we can push the airplanes up to the Canadian border and you can drag them across with horses. Because he's handcuffed by the elements of this Neutrality Act. Now, of course, that's eventually going to be broken down. Right? But even with that, there is some, we better not just totally sit around hands folded. So we begin some peacetime draft. Lend-Lease, talked about that. And then Germany, back to those old nasty U-boats, starts sinking U.S. vessels in the Atlantic. So all this is happening before the U.S. has even entered the war. And so instead of England now in the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, Hitler and the Nazi army invade the Soviet Union, which maybe was their biggest mistake, or at least one of them. Because in June, that means the Soviet winter is going to close in on them as they're moving toward Moscow. Even with that, we're still trying to stay out of European affairs. War would be a mistake. Okay. FDR waiting for a dramatic incident. Well, he's certainly going to get it, right? And I don't, I'm not trying to say that was in his intention, but the Japanese, even some in the higher ups of the Japanese military, said this is a bad idea. Yamamoto, the admiral, says all we're going to do is wake up a sleeping giant. And that's kind of what happened. So the Japanese, why would they do this? Why would they try to awaken a sleeping giant? They didn't. What they wanted to do was deal a knockout blow to the Pacific Fleet, because that's what we need to prosecute a war in the Pacific. And they came close. The thing that saved us, maybe by luck more than anything else, was Battleship Row was full. And there you can see the USS Arizona going down. But the aircraft carrier fleet in the Pacific was out doing maneuvers, doing training. And so they weren't in Pearl Harbor. And so they survived. And so up to this point, naval warfare, the battleship was the queen of the sea. That's why we had so many. But now we don't. And so we have to rethink naval strategy. And now the aircraft carrier, you see that really come to the front as far as the most powerful weapon. And so, of course, that event's going to lead us in. But leading up to it, this idea of more and more invasion of Lower China. Indo means lower. So parts of those islands in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor's attacked while the Roosevelt administration is talking to the Japanese ambassadors. So the Japanese knew it was coming. After the attack, Roosevelt, in that very famous day that will live in infamy, addresses Congress the next day and seeks a declaration of war, because that's how it's supposed to work in the Constitution. And of course he gets it. I think there's one dissenting vote on going to war with Japan. Right? There's always one. So there's some interesting things about this. Sank or damaged 8 battleships. We tend to think it was the entire fleet. It wasn't. But believe it or not, some of those were refloated and repaired. Now, it took a while. Obviously, the Arizona wasn't. But again, that aircraft carrier fleet escaped damage. And it wasn't just Pearl Harbor. There was an attack in the Philippines, in Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore. And so it was a coordinated across-the-board attack on American elements in the Pacific. Here's maybe another A1 mistake by Hitler. We're attacked by Japan. Of course, there's an alliance. We know that. But could Hitler and Germany just stay out of it? The United States declares war on Japan. But then Hitler, because he's in the Axis alliance, declares war on the U.S. So what are we going to do? We respond. You declare war on us? Oh, yeah? Well, you got that back at you. So I don't know. It's an imponderable. Could that have happened where Hitler just stays out of the Pacific War? Maybe. And so the results, catastrophic. You know, the battleships were parked on what they call Battleship Row. I mean, it's like the perfect setup to blow things up, to sink them. Almost unanimous. Yeah, there's one. People are supportive. It's kind of a post 9/11 moment. We've been attacked. The country comes together to support military response. Right? Some accuse FDR, keeping them unprepared. I don't really buy that, but there were some missteps that maybe we should have known it was coming. And so you can see the quantity, the scope and scale, how many people serve. And not just that, it's like almost everybody is involved in the war effort in some form or fashion. It doesn't have to be carrying a gun, that you can do things to help support the war effort. $300 billion, that was real money back then, right? And so there's the Arizona Memorial. Still can go out and see that out in Pearl Harbor. You can see the outline of the ship. And there's still every once in a while little, oil slicks come up from the fuel that was on board because it sank so quickly. So here's your Pacific theater. So we have two theaters of war now. This is, no kidding, a true world war. You've got the Pacific theater and the European theater. And so can we fight full blast in both theaters? The answer is no. And so we'll get to that. But this is the extent of the Japanese kind of picket line, if you will. The extent of their control of the Pacific. And what they want to do is solidify this so that the U.S. can't come back and attack it. And so, well, why don't we just go, we've been attacked at Pearl Harbor, why don't we just go straight to Japan? Well, in a sense we do. The Doolittle raids was symbolic. We sent some bombers to drop bombs on Tokyo, but it didn't do much except for kind of emotionally support the war effort. What comes to pass is known as island hopping. That's how we prosecute the Pacific War. And so instead of going straight there, we go down to Vanuatu, where I've actually been quite a bit, and then up through the Solomon Islands and island hop our way up through Okinawa, heading toward mainland Japan. One of the key battles early in the second year of the Pacific War is this Battle of Midway. It was a carrier battle, and we did a lot of damage to their carrier fleet, which helped us in prosecuting this Pacific War. Okay. There's Yamamoto on the top, and that's Tojo on the bottom. And you can see that I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant. Yamamoto does not survive the war. He dies when his aircraft was shot down. Tojo does, and he's sentenced for war crimes and executed after the war. Oops. As we go to war, this happens often in Washington. You throw money at something. Some of it goes to people that steal it. So there's committees to try to keep that waste down. We're still in a depression at this point, so there's not a ton of money to throw around. But what we can do now is shift some of those factories, and maybe some that have been sitting idle because there was nobody buying product X. Now we can start making tanks and planes and weapons of war. And so the economic, kind of the industrial might of America starts to kick in. And now the boys training up to go fight, now we need to bring in others to work in the factory. So Rosie the Riveter, right? Women, minorities, people to help build those weapons of war. And it's very successful. And yes, there's rationing. My grandparents had rationing cards. You can get so much meat, so much sugar, etc. But we're all in this together. So there wasn't a lot of complaining about it. Wages were decent. And so we can see at least the elements of, if we win this war, the beginnings of driving ourselves out of the depression. Okay, saved by war bonds. I'll show you some propaganda. Buying a war bonds, giving money to the government to help them use that to build equipment to fight the war with. And we're confident. This is one of those, it seems very clear cut, that we're fighting against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, who attacked us at Pearl Harbor. And so this confidence of we're doing the right thing is there, unlike some wars after that, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, ×2. And so you see the kids here. This is a picture from the time. Some are doing it wrong. This is obscene, actually. It kind of means up your bum. But the peace sign, it actually starts out as V for victory. That's where it comes from. And in the 60s, it's co-opted into the peace sign. And you see some of the kids, they're doing it wrong with it. What do they know? So they're standing on this pile of junk, right? What are they doing? Well, they're collecting up to recycle metal, rubber, pieces, things, elements, resources that can be used to help prosecute the war effort. And does this pile of junk make a dent in making a tank? Probably not. But what does it do? It gives them, I am part of this. We're all in this together to get to victory. V for victory. Right? And there's some buy war bonds from Norman Rockwell, pretty famous painter, very, virtuistic based. Abraham Lincoln, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, those elements, the pillars of our society that at least back then we still believed in. Right, a little bit more detailed map of the island hopping campaign and how we're going to prosecute it. Here, it's known as the New Hebrides back then. It's now called Vanuatu. And I told you guys a war story about Vanuatu. It's used as the logistical jumping off point because it's outside of the Japanese picket line. And so that's where we're going to have the stuff, and then we're going to slowly start moving ourselves through Guadalcanal, Papua New Guinea, etc., up and eventually toward the mainland. And as we get closer, the fighting gets more and more ferocious in the Pacific. One of the early battles is here on a thing called the, just slipped my mind. You guys are going to talk about it on Monday. Oh, Bataan, the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. Remember, that was attacked at the same time Pearl Harbor was, and so the U.S. actually has to surrender there. Oof. And so I'll leave that to the team to talk about it, and that means we're almost done. So now here's the question. True World War, 2 theaters, Pacific and European. The Japanese attacked us. Where do we focus? The most common answer is Japan, and there's a rational answer there, but what we decide is Germany, because Germany's seen as the bigger threat. And if Hitler's able to solidify his position in Europe and build what he called Fortress Europa, there may be no getting back in. Okay, and so that's why we focus more on Germany first. Now, we do fight in the Pacific, certainly, but there was a bad assumption in this plan that if Germany surrenders, then probably the Japanese will too. And that was probably the exact opposite. So, but that's where we focus, and that's why Germany seemed more formidable. That's the bad assumption. Japan obviously didn't quit once Germany surrendered. U.S. interests. Obviously, a lot of the immigrants to the United States since the beginning have come from Europe. So that's a kind of a natural focus. And MacArthur's in charge. In fact, MacArthur has to flee the Bataan Peninsula to go to Australia so he's not captured. And FDR, and then once we get to Truman, they thought of MacArthur as kind of a quasi-dictator. All right, so there we are. We've gotten the beginnings of the U.S. is now involved, and we're going to focus on Germany first. So that's where we're going to pick it up once we get back together physically in class next Monday, the 25th. So I will see you guys then.